We had always been a group of adventurous friends who enjoyed exploring unusual places. So when we learned that an old amusement park, long closed to the public, was offering a nighttime tour for select groups, we jumped at the chance. The park had an aura of nostalgia and mystery, with its worn rides and structures hinting at a happier past. We arrived at the park at dusk, and the atmosphere was a blend of excitement and melancholy. The guide introduced us to an operational area of the park, the Security and Control Center. The rest of the park was dark and deserted, yet still retained a charm of faded grandeur. As night fell and the guide left us to explore on our own, the surroundings turned surreal. The park, which had seemed so vibrant by day, was now enveloped in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional creaking of old rides swaying in the breeze. We decided to explore the more distant parts of the park, where the oldest attractions were located. As we ventured further, we began to notice something odd. In an area where the rides were clearly out of use, a carousel began to spin slowly, even though there was no visible power source. The old music that should have been silent started playing in a distorted manner. We tried to convince ourselves it was just an electrical glitch, but the discomfort was starting to set in. We decided to ignore the carousel and head towards the Ferris wheel, which had been stationary for years. As we approached, the lights began to flicker on and off, one after the other, as if someone were trying to activate the ride. Panic started to build among us. The sound of gears, usually silent, began resonating through the structure. Something was clearly wrong. We decided to return to the meeting point, but as we crossed the park, other rides began to exhibit strange behaviors. A haunted house seemed to move slowly, despite the lack of visible tracks. The sound of distorted laughter and screams echoed from a distant past. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. At every corner, the sound of footsteps and muffled breathing seemed to follow our movements. Toy lights flickered intermittently, creating a sense of being trapped in a nightmarish version of reality. When we tried to contact the guide or anyone at the park, we found that our cell phones had no signal, as if an invisible force were blocking all attempts at communication. The tension increased with each passing minute, and the sense of being trapped in a place that seemed to come alive at night was palpable. Finally, we decided to leave the park immediately. We ran back along the path, passing rides that continued to operate in strange and frightening ways. When we finally exited the park, the relief was accompanied by a disquieting feeling that something was still following us. The next day, when we tried to explain our experience, the park reported no technical issues and stated that all attractions were in a state of preservation. The security footage from our visit showed only normal images, with no visible anomalies. The experience left us with a feeling of discomfort and uncertainty. What was meant to be a fun adventure turned into a disturbing nightmare. To this day, the park's rides seem to have taken on a life of their own in our memories, and the silence of the night has never felt so threatening. It was a clear and sunny day when I decided to visit the abandoned amusement park, renowned for its deactivated rides and unsolved mysteries. I have always been fascinated by forgotten places, and the park, with its haunted reputation and glorious past, seemed like the perfect spot for exploration. I arrived at the park early in the morning. The entrance gate was rusty and creaked as it opened, but there was a certain charming nostalgia about it. Armed with an old map, I began exploring the less visited areas, such as the haunted house and the mirror maze. Despite its state of disrepair, the park still had a melancholic beauty. During my walk, I encountered what appeared to be another visitor exploring the park. We exchanged greetings, chatted briefly, and then each went our separate ways. As the day progressed, I decided to explore a more remote section of the park home to the oldest attractions like a dusty Ferris wheel and a deactivated roller coaster. The silence was deep and unsettling, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the rusted structures. While I was in the roller coaster area, I started hearing a distant noise that sounded like a muffled scream. The sound seemed to come from one of the adjacent buildings, partially covered by vegetation and debris. My instinct was to follow the sound, thinking it might be the other visitor needing help or perhaps an animal trapped somewhere. Entering the building, the sound became clearer, as if someone were calling for help. The space was dark and filled with cobwebs, with a strong smell of dampness and decay. Flickering emergency lights cast eerie shadows, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. I followed the sound to a room at the back of the building, but upon entering, I found no one. The room was empty except for some old furniture and papers scattered on the floor. The scream abruptly stopped, and silence returned. I decided to explore the building further, but I began to feel increasingly uncomfortable, as if being watched. While searching for an exit, I noticed my cell phone had no signal. Panic set in as I realized I was lost in the maze of corridors within the abandoned park. Every turn seemed to lead to another empty hallway, and the silence was only broken by the echo of my own footsteps. Finally, I found an exit to the outside and, with relief, returned to the main park area. I tried to find the other visitor, but there was no sign of him. The park also seemed to have changed. Areas that had once been familiar were now filled with obstacles and unknown paths. As daylight began to fade, panic took hold. I decided to call the police, but due to the park's remote location and lack of cell service, help took longer than expected. The search for the missing visitor revealed signs of his passage, but he seemed to have vanished without a trace. When the police finally arrived, they conducted a thorough search but found no trace of the visitor. The park once again returned to being a deserted place, with its rides inert and silent. The experience left me with a profound sense of unease and fear. What could have caused the scream I heard? Why did the visitor disappear without a trace? To this day, the amusement park remains a mystery. Stories about the disappearance still circulate, and the feeling that something is hidden in the park's shadows has never left us. The park, with its glorious past and somber present, continues to be an enigma that few dare to explore. Working at the amusement park at night has always been a unique experience. Sometimes, the silence that follows the park's closing is almost deafening, and the feeling of being alone in a place usually filled with laughter and music can be quite unsettling. However, I knew it was part of my job, and despite the discomfort, the routine was simply part of the role. One night, while on my usual rounds, something peculiar began to happen. The park was closed for maintenance, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of old structures and the wind passing through the rides. I was checking the security system and the lighting when I noticed some of the emergency lights beginning to flicker erratically. Deciding to investigate, I approached the roller coaster area, where the emergency lights were flickering more intensely and sometimes went out completely, plunging the place into total darkness. The security system seemed to be functioning properly, but the behavior of the lights was unusual. As I got closer to the roller coaster, I realized that the sound of an old carousel was playing, even though it was completely shut off. The melody was a hauntingly sweet tune that seemed to echo from nowhere. I walked over to the carousel and, to my surprise, it was moving, with the horses spinning slowly as if driven by an invisible force. The discomfort began to turn into concern when I noticed that some of the rides were moving on their own. The Ferris wheel, which had been stationary for weeks for maintenance, appeared to be turning very slowly, and the roller coaster tracks were vibrating as though someone was walking on them. I decided to check the park's central control room, where the energy and ride control systems were located. The path to the control room was filled with shadows and unsettling noises, and the feeling of being watched was palpable. When I reached the control room, I found the door slightly ajar and a strange chill in the air. Inside the control room, the security monitors displayed images from various areas of the park, but the screen was filled with static. I tried to check the systems and restart the controls, but nothing seemed to work. The power systems were in perfect condition, yet something was still affecting the rides. While I was attempting to resolve the issue, I heard the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps coming from outside the room. Fear began to set in, and the feeling that someone or something was approaching became almost unbearable. I checked the monitors again and noticed a strange figure appearing in the footage, moving quickly through the shadows. With my heart racing, I decided to leave the control room and search for the source of the noise. As I walked through the dark corridors, I found an area of the park that seemed to have been completely transformed. The rides that had been stationary were now in motion, as if preparing for a grand attraction that would never happen. As dawn began to break, the panic finally gave way to a momentary relief. The system returned to normal, and the rides stopped moving. When I reported the incident to the park manager, he seemed perplexed and found no technical explanation for what had occurred. The power and control systems were intact, and there were no records of malfunctions. However, what I experienced that night left a deep mark on me. The sensation of being alone in a place that seemed, in some way, to come alive and transform into something strange and threatening was an experience I will never forget. The park, with its dark atmosphere and the rides that seemed to act on their own, remains a mystery I have never been able to fully explain.